03:47 hours, March 14th, 1944. The control room of U-432 was a tomb of absolute silence. Lieutenant Commander Hermann Eckart stared intently at the nautical chart before him. The hydrophone emitted a series of chilling clicks, the unmistakable sound of over 40 moored mines surrounding their vessel. They were smack dab in the middle of the Allied Northern Barrage, the most infamous minefield in the entire Atlantic. Each mine packed a staggering 300 pounds of explosives. A single detonation would turn their U-boat into a steel coffin in seconds, but ahead of them, a mere 5 nautical miles away, lay the largest Allied convoy they'd spotted in months. 8 cargo ships, heavily laden and practically unescorted, an impossible target, or the greatest opportunity of their lives. The situation was insane. No U-boat captain in their right mind would ever attempt to navigate an active minefield. Doctrine was clear: avoid it, circumvent it, survive. But Eckart wasn't your average captain. He was one of the few commanders who had survived the catastrophic May of '43, when the Allies sank a staggering 43 U-boats in a single month. He'd witnessed firsthand the collapse of Admiral Donitz's Wolfpack tactics. He had lived to see the glorious days fade into memory, and he knew something the Allies didn't. Desperation breeds ingenuity. The crew of U-432 consisted of 48 men, now 73 days at sea, a Type 7C U-boat. Displacing 769 tons, 252 feet long, armed with 4 bow torpedo tubes and a single stern tube. Maximum diving depth, 656 feet, although Eckart knew the boat would implode at 8:20. That day, they would test those limits in ways no one thought possible. The hydrophone pierced the silence with its incessant beeping. Petty Officer Werner Schultz, the hydrophone operator, whispered the numbers. At least 42 separate mine signatures, scattered between 49 and 239 feet. A 3-dimensional labyrinth of death. Eckart had studied the minefield exhaustively. The Allies had laid 70,000 mines between Scotland and Norway. The American mines were particularly treacherous. They didn't even require direct contact. They detonated when a metallic object passed within a 98-foot radius. Magnetic detonators, unbelievably sensitive. A Type 7 U-boat was 20 feet wide. That theoretically left 77 feet of clearance on either side. Theoretically. In reality, with currents, minimal visibility, and water pressure anomalies, it was a death sentence. But Eckart had a plan. A crazy, suicidal, brilliant plan. He wouldn't bypass the minefield. He wouldn't turn back. He would go right through it, and on the other side, he'd sink 8 ships. The British radio transmissions they'd intercepted were clear. The convoy felt safe. They thought no U-boat would dare to venture through the minefield. The escort was minimal. 2 old corvettes. That was it. Eckart saw his chance. One last great hunt. The method he would choose had never been tried before. He would dive to precisely 279 feet, just below the deepest mines, but not so deep that the water pressure crushed the boat. He would proceed at minimum speed, a mere 2 knots, barely moving. This would reduce the boat's magnetic field. And he would use the hydrophone, not to hunt ships, but to map mines. Every single one, in real time, in total darkness, 279 feet below the surface, while 48 men barely breathed. At 04:12 hours, Eckart gave the order. All hands to battle stations, absolute silence, no unnecessary noise. Even the diesel engines were shut down. They were running solely on electric motors. 750 horsepower, whisper quiet. The depth gauges ticked down, 65 feet, then 131, then 197. At 279 feet, they stabilized. The pressure outside was a crushing 125 psi. The steel hull creaked softly. Werner Schultz began relaying the mine positions. Mine number 1, 35 degrees starboard, 59 feet distance, 164 feet depth. Mine number 2, 12 degrees port, 82 feet distance, 131 feet depth. Mine number 3, Eckhart navigated like a surgeon performing a delicate operation, his scalpel mere millimeters from a vital nerve. Each course correction was precise. 2 degrees starboard, hold. 1 degree port, hold. The men in the control room couldn't see the mines. They had to trust Schultz, they had to trust Eckhart, and they had to trust that the magnetic detonators weren't more sensitive than the Allies claimed. At 04:47 hours they passed the 10th mine, a mere 36 feet away. So close they could hear the faint ticking of the firing mechanism through the hull. No one moved. No one spoke. But then, at mine number 15, something unexpected happened. A current, out of nowhere, coming from port, 0.8 knot, strong enough to push the boat 10 feet sideways, directly towards a mine, 62 feet distance, 59 feet, 56 feet. Schultz practically screamed, closing on the mine at 52 feet. Eckhart reacted instinctively. Hard to starboard, the electric motors whined. The boat turned, sluggishly, so slowly at that depth. 49 feet, 46 feet, the critical zone, 43 feet. And then it stabilized, 42 feet. They held, the mine remained inert. Either the detonator was faulty or they had experienced unbelievable luck. Eckhart didn't know which, and he didn't care. 43 minutes later, they were through the deadliest minefield of the war. All 42 mines mapped, all avoided, all survived. Eckhart ordered a cautious ascent to periscope depth, 59 feet. The periscope broke the surface, and there, unbelievably close, a mere 2.6 nautical miles away, lay the convoy, 8 cargo ships in 2 neat rows. The British corvettes were 6 nautical miles to the south, completely oblivious. The convoy was proceeding in calm waters, at 8 knots, heading 275 degrees. They believed they were completely safe. They had the minefield as their protection, but their protection was now their trap. Eckhart calculated quickly. At 8 knots, the ships would be out of torpedo range in 28 minutes. He had 4 torpedoes in the bow tubes, 1 in the stern, 5 torpedoes, 8 targets. He needed to reload. He needed to be perfect. He gave the orders. Torpedoes 1 and 2. Target designated as the lead ship, a 9,000-ton freighter. Torpedo 3, the second ship in the starboard row. Torpedo 4, stand by. The torpedoes were G7E models, electric, no bubble trail, virtually invisible. Range 500 yards at 30 knots. But Eckhart would fire from 3,060 yards, almost impossible to miss. 05:31 hours, fire! Torpedo 1 launched, 3 seconds. Torpedo 2 launched, 6 seconds. Torpedo 3 launched. In the control room, the stopwatch started. 84 seconds to impact. Eckhart kept the periscope trained on the target. The crew held their breath. At 79 seconds, Eckhart saw the first explosion. The bow of the lead freighter erupted in a cloud of fire and metal, right below the waterline. Deadly. The ship immediately began to list. At 82 seconds, the second explosion, same freighter amidships. It broke apart. At 86 seconds, Torpedo 3 struck the second ship astern. It began to sink. 3 torpedoes, 2 ships destroyed, a third damaged. But now, the convoy knew something was wrong. The corvettes turned sharply, full speed, heading for the sinking ships. Lieutenant Commander Eckhart had maybe 8 minutes before they arrived. He ordered the torpedo tubes reloaded. The crew worked like men possessed. Each torpedo weighed 1.5 tons in a 2.2-meter-wide tube underwater. in rough seas. It normally took 12 minutes. They had 8. Petty Officer Franz Keller drove his team on, releasing safety catches, rolling the torpedo into position, aligning it, shoving it into the tube, locking it. 6 minutes passed. The corvettes were 4 kilometers away. Eckhart could see their bow waves. At 7 minutes, tubes 1 and 2 were loaded. Eckhart had no time for perfect solutions. He targeted the 3rd and 4th ships, both about 3,200 meters away, already trying to turn away. Fire! Both torpedoes launched. 96 seconds to impact. At 91 seconds, the first depth charges hit. The corvettes had fired blindly, hoping to hit the U-boat. Type D depth charges, 181 kilograms of TNT, set to 60 meters depth, too shallow. Eckhart was at 85 meters. But the pressure waves were still brutal. The whole boat shook, pipes burst, water sprayed in the galley. At 94 seconds, his torpedoes struck. 2 more ships heavily damaged. 1 sank immediately. The other drifted, burning. The corvettes were now directly overhead. Eckhart ordered emergency depth, 150 meters, 170 meters, 190 meters, dangerously close to the limit. More depth charges, these set to 90 meters. Closer, much closer. The explosions were deafening. All the lights went out. Emergency power kicked in. Red light everywhere. A young sailor, barely 19 years old, William Brandt, began to cry. Eckhart put his hand on his shoulder. Steady. We'll survive this. We've survived worse. 23 depth charges in 11 minutes. None hit directly, but the cumulative damage was serious. The stern planes responded sluggishly. A leak in ballast tank number 3. The batteries were losing capacity, but Eckhart still had an ace up his sleeve. A final torpedo in the stern tube, and 2 ships were still intact. He waited 47 minutes, completely still at 195 meters, while the corvettes searched. Then, as they turned north, he ordered a cautious ascent to 60 meters. Periscope depth, there. 6.8 kilometers away. The 2 remaining freighters separated, trying to escape. Eckhart chose the larger one, 12,000 tons, full of supplies for the British Army. He maneuvered the U-boat into position. Stern tube. Distance 4,200 meters. Marginal range, but doable. Fire. The last torpedo launched. 126 seconds to impact. Eckhart watched through the periscope. At 119 seconds, he saw something incredible. The ship had spotted the torpedo. It was trying to turn. Too slow. Too late. At 126 seconds, the torpedo struck amidships. The ship broke in 2. 5 ships sunk, but Eckhart wasn't finished. He was out of torpedoes, but he had something else. The 8.8 centimeter deck gun. And 2 wounded ships, slowly sinking, but not yet gone. He ordered surfacing, complete surfacing. The bridge broke the surface at 06:23 hours. The deck gun crew, 4 men, scrambled up. The gun was unlocked. The 2 burning freighters were 4.5 kilometers away. Perfect range. 18 shells, each 8.8 centimeters high explosive. They fired systematically. The first ship took 9 shells to the hull. It capsized in 14 minutes. The second ship, already heavily damaged, sank after 7 more hits. 7 ships, in 97 minutes, through a minefield against corvette, with a Type 7C U-boat. It was impossible, but it had happened. Eckhart ordered emergency dive. The corvettes were back, 8 kilometers to the south, heading towards them. U-432 dove to 120 meters and set course back towards the minefield. Yes, back through the minefield. Because that was the only way the corvettes wouldn't follow. The men were horrified, but they followed. They trusted Eckhart absolutely now. If he said through the minefield, then they went through the minefield. The second passage was somehow harder, because they now had the damage, because they were exhausted. because the reality of what they had done was sinking in. But Schultz had mapped the mine positions. He had every single one in his head, and he guided them through one by one in the dark, in the red light of the damaged control room. 51 minutes later, they were through. On the other side, free. The corvettes had given up the chase. U-432 surfaced for surface travel. The diesel engines roared back to life. Fresh air poured in. The men began to laugh, then to cry, then both at the same time. Eckhart stood on the bridge and looked back. Behind him, 15 kilometers away, the ocean was burning. 7 ships, over 70,000 tons. He pulled out his war diary and began to write. March 14th, 1944, 03:47 to 08:15 hours, passage through Northern Barrage Minefield Sector 7. 7 enemy freighters sunk. Total tonnage estimated 71,000. Weapons used, 5 torpedoes, 18 deck gun shells. Own losses, no fatalities. Minor damage to stern planes and ballast tank. Boat fully operational. Return to base planned. But he knew the bare facts didn't tell the story. Not the groaning of the hull at 195 meters depth, not the sweat on Werner Schultz's face as he navigated the mines, not William Brandt's tears, not the moment when they all thought they were going to die, and not the moment when they realized they had survived. The return trip to Lorient took 8 days. Every day they expected attacks. Every day they passed enemy patrols. Every day they wondered how long their luck would last. On March 22, 1944, at 11:30 hours, U-432 entered the port of Lorient. Grand Admiral Dönitz himself stood on the pier. He had received the radio transmissions. He hadn't believed it at first. No one had. 7 ships through the Northern Barrage? Impossible. But there was the boat, there was the crew, and there were the empty torpedo tubes. The debriefings began immediately, not as punishment, but as documentation. Every detail had to be verified. Schultz was questioned for 3 days about the minefield navigation technique. Eckhart provided 11 hours of testimony, detailing the tactical decision-making process. The method they developed, diving beneath the moored mines and mapping them with the hydrophone, was revolutionary. Within 2 weeks, it was incorporated into the official U-boat manual. Dozens of lieutenant commanders were trained in the technique. Some survived because of it. Many did not. But what the Allies didn't understand, not until years after the war, was the psychological dimension. Eckhart hadn't just sunk ships. He'd proven. The minefield wasn't absolute. He'd shown that German resolve and technical skill could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. The British Admiralty, when it received the reports, was shocked. Their entire defense concept rested on the assumption that no U-boat would get through the Northern Barrage. Now they had to escort every convoy, even those they'd considered safe. This tied up hundreds of ships, thousands of men, resources desperately needed elsewhere. A secret British post-war report, declassified in 1989, analyzed the incident. The conclusion was brutal. A single German U-boat lieutenant commander with his crew of 48 had caused more strategic damage than some entire fleet operations. Not because of the 7 ships sunk, significant as those were, but because of the forced reallocation of resources, because of the shattered assumptions, because of the proof that German sailors, even facing overwhelming odds, would find ways to fight. Eckhart himself received the Knight's Cross on April 3, 1944. Dönitz pinned it to his uniform personally. The ceremony was small, just the crew and a few officers. But the words Dönitz spoke were etched into U-boat history. He said, "What you have done will inspire generations of sailors, not because you won, but because you tried, not because it was easy, but because it was impossible. You have shown that human will, when combined with technical skill, can breach any barrier. That is the legacy you leave behind." U-432 made 2 more patrols. Neither was as dramatic as the minefield passage. In August of 1944, as the Allies liberated France, U-432 was transferred to Norway. In November 1944, it was sunk by a British destroyer northwest of Bergen. 14 crew members survived. 34, including Lieutenant Commander Hermann Eckhart, went down with the boat. Werner Schultz was one of the survivors. He spent the rest of the war in a British prisoner of war camp. After the war, he returned to Germany and worked as an acoustics engineer. He lived until 1987. In his later years, he gave several interviews about the minefield passage. He always said the same thing. We knew we were probably going to die, but we believed in Eckhart, and he believed in us. That was all that mattered. The 7 ships sunk were all confirmed in British Admiralty records. The largest, the SS Empire Heritage, at 12,150 tons, carried 8,000 tons of munitions and vehicles. Its loss delayed resupply for the British 8th Army by 3 weeks. The other 6 ships carried similarly critical cargoes. The overall effect on Allied logistics was measurable, though not war decisive. But that was never the point. The point was what the act symbolized. At a time when the U-boat arm was being decimated, when the loss rate exceeded 75%. When young men knew they probably wouldn't return, Eckhart's crew proved that extraordinary courage and skill could still make a difference. Today, more than 80 years later, the minefield passage of U-432 is taught at naval academies in several countries, not as a tactical model. That would be insane. Nobody would try that today. But as a case study in leadership under extreme pressure, in decision-making when all the options are bad, in the trust between a commanding officer and his crew, the questions students are asked are the same ones Eckhart faced. When is an impossible risk justified? How do you calibrate courage against recklessness? What does a leader owe his men when he leads them into hell? There are no perfect answers. Eckhart himself would have said that. He did what he believed was right, with the information he had, in the moment he was in. 48 men staked their lives on his judgment. Most ultimately paid the ultimate price. But for 97 minutes on March 14, 1944, they did the impossible. They drove through a field of 42 moored mines, sank 7 ships, and came out alive. This isn't a glorification of war. It's a recognition of extraordinary human courage, regardless of the uniform worn. The lesson of U-432 isn't that war is glorious, but that humans, when pushed to their limits, are capable of astonishing things. Good people, normal people. Men who, under other circumstances, would have been teachers or engineers or farmers, but history placed them in the control room of a U-boat, 280 feet underwater, surrounded by 42 mines, and they rose to the challenge. That's what we must preserve. Not the statistics, not the politics, but the human stories of courage, fear, trust, and survival. These stories are disappearing. The men who lived them are almost all gone. The archives forgotten. The details fading. Every day we wait, we lose more. That's why projects like this exist, to interview the last surviving witnesses, to digitize locked-away documents, to translate war diaries, to ensure that when, in 100 years, someone asks what happened in those moments, we have answers, real answers, not propaganda, not myths, but the complicated, nuanced, human truth. If this story has moved you, if you believe these moments of history need to be preserved, please support with YouTube Super Thanks. The Golden Heart below. Every contribution directly funds archival research, witness interviews, document digitization. It's not just the big battles that need to be documented. It's these specific moments, these individual acts, these 48 men in U-432. Without support, these stories are lost. Help me preserve them. But there's more to the story of U-432 that needs to be understood. The men on board weren't superheroes. They were average individuals, thrust into extraordinary circumstances. Werner Schultz, the hydrophone operator, used to be a piano teacher from Hamburg before the war. His ability to distinguish individual tones, developed while teaching music students, saved every life in the minefield. Each clicking sound of a mine had a slightly different acoustic signature. Schultz could not only hear the mines, he could estimate their approximate depth based on the pitch, a skill that no military training taught, a skill that came only from years of listening to subtle musical nuances. Frank Keller, the petty officer who directed the torpedo reloading, was a dock worker from Boston. He'd spent his whole life moving heavy loads, balancing weights, optimizing space. In the cramped torpedo room of a Type 7 U-boat, where inches mattered and every movement had to be coordinated, his dockworker instincts were invaluable. He could feel when a torpedo was misaligned before the measuring instruments showed it. He could orchestrate a team of 6 men to load a 1.5-ton weapon into a 2.2-meter tube, while the boat rolled in heavy seas and depth charges exploded outside. William Brandt, the young sailor who wept, was 18 years old. He'd only been on U-432 for 3 months. This was his first combat patrol. He came from a small town in Iowa, had never seen the ocean until he was drafted into the Navy. His fear wasn't cowardice. It was the natural reaction of a young man suddenly 250 feet underwater, surrounded by mines, hearing his boat creak and groan under the pressure. After the mission, after surviving, something changed in Brandt. He found an inner strength he didn't know he possessed. He served on all 4 of U-432's patrols. He was one of the 14 survivors when the boat was sunk. He lived until 2003, reaching the age of 77, and had grandchildren who loved him. But he always said that he died and was reborn in March 1944. The story of these men is important because it shows that heroism isn't innate. It's not something you either have or don't have. It's something that's discovered in moments of extreme trial. Schultz didn't know his musical training would save lives. Keller didn't know his dock work would be critical to the war effort. Brandt didn't know he had the courage to endure. They all discovered parts of themselves that only came to the surface under impossible pressure. And that's the universal truth that transcends all uniforms and all wars. People don't know what they're capable of until they have to be. The teacher becomes a precision acoustician. The dockworker becomes a tactical genius. The frightened boy becomes a steadfast soldier, not because they loved war, not because they sought death, but because they were in that moment, in that boat with those men, and failure meant death, not just for them, but for their comrades. The bond between men facing death together is something that peace can never replicate. Lieutenant Commander Eckhart understood this. His leadership wasn't based on fear or discipline alone. He knew every man on his boat. He knew that Schultz loved music. He knew that Keller solved problems by physically working through them. He knew that Brandt needed encouragement, not harsher orders. A good commander in the U-boat force wasn't just a tactical expert. He was a psychologist, a mentor, a father figure, a friend. In the steel cylinder 650 feet underwater, where you might not see sunlight for months, never breathe fresh air, never have privacy, the human component was as important as any weapon. The living conditions on a Type 7 U-boat were brutal. 48 men shared 12 bunks. That meant hot bunking, sleeping in shifts. When your shift ended, someone else got up and you took their still warm place. The air was thick with the smell of diesel, sweat, mildew, and fear. The temperature fluctuated between freezing cold in northern waters and suffocating heat in the tropics. There were no showers, no running water for personal hygiene. Men went weeks without washing. The only toilet was often out of order when the boat was submerged. Food was monotonous. Bread that grew mouldy after 2 weeks, canned goods, sausage that turned rancid. In the first few days of a patrol, there was fresh fruit and vegetables, but that was quickly used up. Then it was just canned goods and hard rations. Men lost weight. Their skin turned pale from lack of sunlight. Many developed skin diseases from the constant dampness. And that was on normal days, when no one was trying to kill them. On days like March 14th, 1944, everything else was added to the mix. Imagine being in that environment, 73 days without land contact, exhausted, undernourished, and then being told you're going to drive through a field of 42 mines. The natural reaction would be mutiny, or at least resistance. But none of Eckhart's men refused, not because they had to. In the last months of the war, as the situation became hopeless, there were U-boat crews who mutinied. It was rare, but it happened. Eckhart's crew followed him because they trusted him, because he'd brought them home safely before, because they knew that if there was a way to survive, he'd find it. That trust was built over months. On U-432's first patrol under Eckhart in October 1943, they were hunted by a British destroyer for 19 hours, 127 depth charges. The boat was so damaged that they had to sit on the seabed, 600 feet deep, for 11 hours while the air slowly ran out. Eckhart remained calm. He explained to every man exactly what they were going to do. He shut down all non-essential systems. He reduced activity to a minimum to conserve oxygen. And when the destroyer finally left, they surfaced, repaired the boat at sea, and completed their mission. The men saw that Eckhart didn't crack under extreme pressure. That bought their loyalty. That's why, when he said in March 1944, "We're going through the minefield," they said yes, not lightly, not without fear, but with confidence that if anyone could do it, it was him. And they were right. But here's the tragedy. All that trust, all that skill, all that camaraderie, all that courage ultimately didn't save most of them. In November 1944, 8 months after their impossible feat of heroism, 34 of them met their end in the cold waters off Norway. The irony is cruel. They survived mines, depth charges, exhaustion, and then on just an ordinary day, a torpedo struck their U-boat, and it was over. The survivors carried guilt. Werner Schultz wrote in his unpublished memoirs, "Why did I survive? Why not Keller, who was stronger? Why not the lieutenant commander, who was more important? Why a piano teacher whose greatest talent was hearing tones?" These questions had no answers. Death at sea was random, an explosion here instead of there. One man stood on deck, another was below. The difference between life and death was often just meters, or seconds. No heroic sacrifice. No last heroic gesture, just physics, pressures, water, steel, and then darkness. This is the other side of the story that needs to be told. Not just the heroism, but also the price. The 34 men who died left families. Mothers who never stopped waiting at the window. Fathers who could never show the pride they felt. Wives who became widows in their 20s. Children who grew up without fathers. William Brandt survived. But his best friend on the boat, George Mueller, did not. Brandt spoke in interviews about how for the rest of his life he heard George's laughter. How he wondered what George would have done, what he would have become. How the guilt haunted him, even 60 years later. War doesn't just create heroes, it breaks people. Even those who survive carry scars that never fully heal. Schultz had nightmares well into his 70s. He dreamed that he was back in the control room, hearing the mines, turning to Lieutenant Commander Eckhart to report. But when he opened his mouth, no sound came out, and the mines were getting closer and closer, and he would wake up screaming. His wife learned to wake him gently. without touching him, because once he had instinctively lashed out, still trapped in a nightmare from 40 years before. That's the context we need to understand when we talk about military heroism. Yes, what Eckhart and his crew did was extraordinary. Yes, it deserves recognition, but it came at a cost, far beyond the 7 sunken ships. It cost 34 lives instantly. It cost 14 survivors their mental health. It cost dozens of families their loved ones. And for what? 7 cargo ships that didn't change the outcome of the war. A tactical innovation that saved a few U-boats for a few months before they were all lost anyway. A moment of brilliance in a sea of futility. But maybe that's exactly the point. Maybe the value isn't in the strategic results. Maybe it's in the proof that humans, even in the face of absurdity, in the face of impossible odds, in the face of certain death, can choose to be extraordinary. Not for glory, not for honor, not for politics, but for the men beside them, for the camaraderie, for the feeling that if they have to go to hell, they're going to do it as masters of their craft, with dignity, with skill, with courage. Eckhart's last recorded word, transmitted by radio transmissions before U-432 sank, was a single word: Kameraden. Not an order, not a tactical maneuver, just an acknowledgement of the men with whom he shared his final moments. The British radio operators who intercepted it didn't understand its significance, but every German who heard it did. It was a reminder that, even in death, they were not alone. They were brothers, united by shared ordeal, and that, more than any medal or award, was what mattered. The lesson for us, 80 years later, in a world without U-boat warfare or minefields, isn't that we should glorify war, but that we should recognize the human potential, the potential for courage, for skill, for cooperation under pressure, for sacrifice for others. These qualities are not unique to soldiers. They're human. They exist in doctors who risk their lives during pandemics, in firefighters who run into burning buildings, in parents who sacrifice for children, in teachers who teach in dangerous neighborhoods. The context changes. The core trait remains. U-432 shows us that normal people can do extraordinary things when they have to. It also shows us that those extraordinary things come at a terrible price. Both lessons are important. We must celebrate the potential without forgetting the cost. We must honor the courage without glorifying the madness that required it. And above all, we must remember, because forgetting is the second way these men die. The first death is physical. The second is when no one remembers their names, their stories, their humanity. What impressed you the most about this story? The tactical brilliance, the human courage, the tragic price? Or maybe you have your own family stories, grandfathers who served on U-boats, letters found in attics, or diaries that spanned generations. Share below. Every comment is a piece of history preserved. Let's make sure these men are never forgotten.